All right, Anton Stentner podcast, and we're talking about Redfin because we just saw the Redfin CEO on another YouTube video, and there was a lot of questions answered, and I was curious because I sent this to you, what you thought about his answers. He was talking more broadly, but did you notice he talks about Seattle a lot?
Yes.
Yeah.
He talked about our metro. Basically, the Redfin CEO said that housing is to see major price cuts, a soft summer ahead, and he was on David Lin's channel. And you sent it to me, and I was like, Like, it was curiosity. You go, what are your thoughts? And so, what was the first talking point? We'll just kind of go through this.
So the first point was home sellers holding out. What was your thoughts on what he said and how it relates to Seattle?
Yeah, so he said sellers are hesitant to lower prices, making the market sticky despite rising listings. So what I did is I went and looked at Redfin's own data in the Redfin data center. And according to their own data, listings are up 6.9% year over year. That's really not that big of a deal because we've been in such low inventory environment. And so a slight rise there, isn't that bad. Active listings with price drops was 6.9%, which is only up 2% year over year. So when he said sellers are hesitant to lower prices, I disagree. What I think you actually are seeing in the market right now is weak agents not being able to clearly articulate the value, or really strong-minded sellers who are saying, you know what, my neighbor sold for this, I want to try to sell for more.
It's kind of the natural progression of sellers in an appreciated market. You've seen it time and time again. But what's interesting about this market is because inventory is so low, it's not necessarily the sellers thinking this, but it's the agents thinking we might be able to get away with it.
Exactly.
Right. And so I have a neighbor right now that's had his house on the market, I think up to about 2 months, at least a month and a half. And I know, one, they've had to do a price drop, but the fact that it hasn't gone yet. And I know my neighbor, I don't want to say any personal stuff, but it's interesting seeing them prices so high to the point where they can't find a buyer in this low inventory market. So people are getting greedy, but at one point you have to pay the price because interest rates are so high and people can't afford it.
And the market will only bear what the property is worth, essentially. So whatever it's worth is basically what it sells for. Second, that's on a national level. And, Glenn did reference the Seattle area and stuff like that. When we come home to the Seattle area, we're having bidding wars. We are seeing very few price reductions. Here in the metro, it's really tight relative to the rest of the nation. So what's interesting is when you talk about the market nationally, it's kind of hard to say because real estate is a local market business and each local market is behaving differently. So there's parts of the Midwest that are really cold and also really hot. And you're seeing most of the West Coast being very hot, center a little bit cooler, East Coast very hot, which when you think about it, where is the majority of the jobs located?
Major cities,
and most of those major metros are located on the coast, and they have ports and things like that. So that's where a lot of the jobs are located, which is causing those prices to go up.
All right. So next point they were asking about is Canadian bank precautions. Obviously, we're here in the United States. David Lin, the YouTube channel, is based out of, I think, Vancouver, BC.
Yeah.
So he refers to Canada a lot. I don't know why, though, he even brought up Canada because isn't the CEO of Redfin in Seattle?
Yeah.
Right? And so it's like, would he know that much about Canada?
Well, this was the point that they were making. The point that they were making was a lot of these major financial institutions in Canada are increasing their balance sheet, putting extra reserves aside. Now, Canada has debt that is due every 5 years, even on their residential debt, versus in the US, we have 30-year debt. So a lot of our debt is locked in and it's not going to create a problem. In the Canadian market, it is going to create a problem because you have so much residential debt that's now going to turn over from a 3 to, anywhere between a 6 to a 7.
Just to give a little context here for American listeners, this is kind of a crazy thing. Here in America, you get a typical mortgage. You're locked in for 30 years
Yes.
at whatever interest rate. And
Yes.
so we're locked in. So people that bought at 2 and 3%, they don't want to get rid of it. In Canada, you have to renew every 3, 5, and 7 years. I think they might have some that are a little bit more, but that's unique because when you have to renew, you renew at today's interest rate.
Bingo.
So what happened to people in ARMS back in the 2000s
Yes.
that got America in trouble and maybe like the rest of the world because they were doing adjustable rates is actually happening, but
Yes.
in an extended period of time in Canada. And what's nuts to me is when I talk to my Canadian friends and family, how used to it they are, but they've never been in an environment where interest rates got raised so much
Yes.
and house prices being record highs.
Yes.
So
Yeah, so Canada is in trouble. Now let's flip into the U.S. The U.S. itself, though, we do have the brewing of that commercial crisis in the background. And so our banks are gearing up and increasing their reserves too. But it's more for the commercial debt on our side. Theirs is a residential debt problem. Second, the thing to be thinking about for most of our listeners here in the U.S. is if banks are increasing their balance sheets, it means they don't want to lend out as much money. So things are getting tighter. So once again, I very much agreed with both the host and the CEO of Redfin here.
All right, next point that David brought up was timing home purchases. Can you tell us what is going on and what's your thoughts on his opinion?
This is the age-old question. He goes to the CEO of Redfin, is now a right time to buy? And he goes, it's never the wrong time to buy a great piece of real estate, but don't rush in and just buy a house to buy a house because the transactional costs of selling one are high. I was like, totally agree. And then he came up with the line that, to be honest, I just don't like. He said, marry the house, date the rate. Now, everybody says that. It's semi-cliche, but the idea is if I love the house and the location, it's good for me and my family, then as rates come down, it simply becomes more affordable. The wisdom that he shared, though, is don't rush into a transaction because transactional costs to resale, if you decide it's not the right property, are expensive. What's funny, though, is you have to kind of slice some of the words from his bias because Redfin is a discount broker. So as he says things, he is promoting their methodology of doing business. So he says, transactional costs are high. Oh, but I run a discount brokerage and we can do that for you cheaper.
I did feel he was pretty fair
Yes.
in his answering. He wasn't too biased or, just trying to sell his services. He was straight. What was impressive is he was straight answering the questions based off of what would be the best advice for the whole audience.
Yes.
Not trying to be like, create too much leverage for himself and his business, which is unique because, of course, his role as a CEO is to sell his services.
Yeah,
and it wasn't oversold.
Is to maximize shareholder value.
And that's why I thought this video was worth not only watching, but commenting on
100%.
because he has the most data of anybody.
And so next I started talking about U.S. Housing market dynamics. And we've discussed this at length, but the idea, very simple, is interest rates rose dramatically. As interest rates rose dramatically, that took that traditional move-up seller, it locked them into their mortgage and created what we call the lock-in effect, which prevented the seller from moving and becoming a move-up buyer. That's going to keep inventory in the U.S. locked up for probably the next 2 to 3 years until rates come down significantly. He nailed this right here. Nothing to argue with there. The next item they started talking about was this idea of the affordability crisis. And I did feel that there was a little bit of placating here, and then the selling of their model. So what he said was, the dream of home ownership is becoming less and less attainable, especially for millennials, which is impacting their economic optimism. Now, I'm paraphrasing. These are my words specifically. But he said, affordability is at an all-time low. It's not. You got to measure things correctly. Affordability right now is not an all-time low. It was actually less affordable 40 years ago in the early 80s. And you go, well, what did the early 80s and today have in common? We had high inflation where we had to jack interest rates through the roof. So let's compare the two of those. In the two of those, actually the early 80s was less affordable than today. And an interesting dialogue that Nucci and I were having was this idea of, you know, the younger generation, they go on social media and they complain about it. And they say the American dream is dead. And I would say the dollar is different today and their experience is different. So I was a kid that grew up in the 80s. Okay, I was born in 1979.
Game Boy.
I got it, late 80s, got the Game Boy, late 80s. And in 1984, they launched the Nintendo. And I was blessed to get a Nintendo for Christmas. And I thought it was the coolest thing ever. Today, in my house, we have 3 gaming PCs. So I had 1 Nintendo. We have 3 Xboxes. We have 2 Wii U's. I have 7 Nintendo DS's.
How many phones?
We have 5 phones and 3 tablets.
So if they're not gaming, they're probably on the phone too.
And the reason I bring that up is the below 40 generation discounts. When they say it's not affordable and the American dream is dead, they discount this massive amount of choices that they have and these different options. Nucci and I were even joking, like, almond milk didn't exist when I was a kid. You had whole milk, 2%, and 1%. Now there's 20 different kinds of almond milk.
Even the fridge just was more plain.
Yeah,
right. Your pantry was more plain.
It was a smaller fridge.
Yeah, I want to say one thing, because if you just compare the spending of anyone in the early 80s compared to now, well, in the early 80s, you did not have the internet and Amazon and the ability to just buy whatever.
Yes.
2, you didn't buy as many things.
Yeah.
Okay. And then 3, like for kids, but even grown-ups, there was a lot more things you did that were free back then versus now everything kind of costs money. There's like a price tag. So I believe that things are very unaffordable.
Extremely.
But when you're looking at numbers, maybe not as unaffordable. But in today's context with modern way of living, yeah, it's crazy. I think the one thing that, I don't know if you looked into this or know about this, is the rate at which people not only make money and make more money. Like, are raises happening slower now compared to the 80s?
The wage growth, except for during the last 3 years, was definitely slower.
In the 80s?
No, slower now.
Yeah, for sure.
So, except for during the pandemic. So, you know, the pandemic caused a spike in wage growth, which is good. So, 1, I want people to make more money. 2, I really believe that we are unaffordable. But it's very hard when they compare generations to generations, because they're not making these apples to apples comparisons, because we just didn't have all those things.
And honestly, it doesn't even matter
Yeah,
what
it
happened
doesn't
in the
matter.
early 80s. Like, what's happening right now?
Bingo.
Right.
And next, what they started talking about was this idea of housing market predictions. So Glenn said he anticipates a softening market, particularly in the middle market segment, with some supply coming and softening prices. So I really disagree with him here, and I disagree on multiple levels, and here's why. So yes, active listings are up almost 16%, so 15.79 according to the Redfin data center. So I just went in and used their own data. But because supply is so low right now, even a 15-16% increase in supply has not been enough to create any sort of massive changes in prices across the US. So the median price this year is still up and still trending up. What you see is it slowing because inventory is rising. But what this discounts is it discounts the fact that we believe rates will be lower later this year. And we believe, especially when you go back and look at history, so always look at history. Like what happens, let me ask you, generally speaking, what do you think happens to interest rates in a presidential election year? Do you think they go up, down, or sideways?
Well, if it's a re-election year for somebody, maybe it goes down, right? If they're not going to be reelected, maybe it could be it could go down or it just stays the same.
Great answer, logical, well thought. The reality is every election cycle, doesn't matter whether they have the potential to get reelected or not, generally speaking, rates go down. Why? Because uncertainty happens around the presidential election. So the stock market cools down, money moves out of stocks over into bonds, and as money moves into bonds, it drives rates down. It's just the uncertainty. Regardless of the political bias people want to think happens, it's actually the uncertainty. So we know rates will trend slightly down for the rest of the year. This is why I totally disagree. Like you can see it in the data, it rising, but there's not enough housing coming to dramatically affect prices. Plus, it looks like rents are growing again. So as rents start to grow, people want to buy more homes.
Isn't that one of the topics they talk about, which was rent?
They do talk about rent later.
Oh, got it.
And then one thing I want to drop on this too is I want to drop the Seattle Metro. In the Seattle Metro, I want to tell everyone this is not happening for any freaking reason. We are in crazy town, bidding war central.
Why?
We put on a property this last week on Friday. It received 9 offers and it sold for 45 grand more. I talked to a large builder in the area who put on a property in Bothell. The property in Bothell went on for $1,550,000 and it sold for 130 some offers, 1,890 some thousand. And so the bidding wars are here because our supply is so low. Now remember, they're talking about the whole country, but I want to let you know our local metro is on fire. It's so hot that one of the buyer's sisters knew my name because we had done a deal together, and the buyer's sister called me on the phone to tell me the case for why we should sell it to her brother. And honestly, they made a great offer and they moved it up and they waived all the contingencies and they still lost because at the last second, someone came in with an even higher offer and trumped them. And so this is the thing we have to be careful about. This is what I want our investors, our buyers, our sellers paying attention to, is we listen to national news and we go, that's what's happening here in the Seattle Metro. You need to look at the actual data and talk to experts. Go to resg.com and you can connect with us to talk with actual experts about what's happening in our market because our market's busy. Well, if the Fed, and we're going to talk about this later, you can go watch our one on CPI. If the Fed is lowering rates and CPI is coming in lower, we know rates are going down. It's just a function of time. As rates go down, more buyers qualify. It's just going to get busier.
And potentially prices go up.
As demand increases and supply stays the same, prices go up. Supply and demand. Here we go. Let's rock and roll.
Another thing they talk about in that podcast is changes in the real estate industry. Can you explain what they were saying there?
Yeah. So, the host David asked Glenn, he says, hey, what do you think about the NAR settlement? What's the major changes that are happening now? And I like what he says, and then I also like have to take it with a grain of salt. He says, you know what, this is creating structural shifts in the real estate industry where the buyer is going to have to pay their own compensation, and that this might reshape the real estate landscape, offering more opportunities to consumers. And he believes that this is then going to push them to go to the seller even more. And I was like, bullshit. Let me explain why. The buyer is so emotionally tied to the product. For them to go to the listing broker and then trust the listing broker, it doesn't happen. Second, massive litigation across the US is from private party transactions. So yes, I understand the NAR settlement is forcing this, but I don't believe it's going to help the consumer. I believe it's going to end up hurting the consumer. And then they talk about, well, the seller's paying this. And this is where I just kind of disagree with the media in general, not just Glenn. Is the seller paying the commission, or is the buyer paying it because they're paying it in the purchase price? So it's kind of all baked into the purchase price, and the buyer's then getting that loan for $750,000, which then pays those commissions. He thought it would cause more people to go to the listing broker, and that would then maybe create fees around 3% versus the 5 to 6%, which is kind of more normal. And then David was like, well, are you seeing this? He's like, nah, not really. And so then he kind of backpedals from it and blamed other big players in the industry. And he's like, well, you know, the old guard is holding this up. They're pushing back against it. And I disagree. Consumers want protection because houses are so expensive. They want someone that's going to fight on their side. And then the Veterans Administration, which acted unbelievably fast for the VA, came out this week and said buyers can now finance in their buyer's agent costs so they can have representation. So the government has already said on a whole other hand, we believe the buyer needs representation and needs to be able to be paid for.
So it almost doesn't even matter what NARS did because the market is balancing it out, which you actually said this about a month ago.
We predicted this. We talked all about this. And this is what's really fun with like recording videos and content. You can go back and see what we said. We said, you know what? We think it's going to turn into slightly different way of doing it, but it's basically going to turn out being the same. And that's kind of how we're starting to see this play out.
One question on that note, though, do you think this is where he's kind of maybe playing a certain angle?
Yes.
Because this is Redfin's business?
Yes,
right?
They're totally playing the certain angle because the reason he talks about that in transactions fees, because that's their selling point, is the transaction fee and not the service. And if that was working, well, you know, let's just go through it right now. If that was working, maybe Redfin would be making a bunch of money instead of losing a bunch of money. So let's just go through the data. P.S. You can find this right on Redfin's website. So the market hasn't been very kind to Redfin. Today, they're losing money. Q4 2024, they lost $66.7 million. Their available cash balance since 2020 has been shrinking, going down. Right now, their total debt is $1.071 billion. Their total shareholder equity is in a deficit of $45 million. So you should never have shareholder equity in a deficit. In other words, what this means for Redfin in general, Redfin is burning cash and losing money and requires cash infusions to keep it running right now. So part of this is he's plugging the model, trying to keep their business alive. And that came right out of their stock report. So like this is disclosed on their, these are real numbers on their website. It shows you how much money they're losing.
Question.
Yes.
Is Redfin going to be able to survive this season of the market? And what do you think is going to happen to them 1 to 5 years from now?
I believe they will survive this season of the market because even though I'm poking a little bit of fun right there, brilliant people built a brilliant tech platform there. And I very much respect that. And I respect the level of data and the people they have running it. I don't agree with the model that they built, but I agree with the tech.
The one thing about Redfin, from somebody like me who's kind of on the internet side, just attention side,
Yes.
is Redfin has become an MLS for the consumer.
Yes.
So if
Yes.
you don't know, MLS is a tool that real estate agents use. But even me, who has real estate agent friends, broker friends, I used Redfin because I don't have access to MLS. I'm not licensed anymore. So I use that to do my research. In my mind, I'm thinking, even if their business model doesn't work out, they have created an awareness that that's where you go to get information on houses. When I get people like, Sean, when he was looking for houses years ago, he would send me Redfin listings. Yeah.
And that's what I mean exactly. That's why I said the part I love, they built some beautiful, sexy tech, and they've got great data. I just don't agree with the business model and what they're doing. So both Redfin and Zillow right now are launching mortgage divisions. Well, why are they launching mortgage divisions?
Because the other business model isn't working for them.
Because they need revenue. And so I don't think they'll die and go under. I think someone will come and pick them up, or they may make it all the way through. Because if rates come down, it could make them profitable.
Well, they're already cutting a lot of their workforce.
Yes.
So they're cutting things.
Yeah.
Okay, let's jump to rent controls.
Yeah.
Because for me, the rent control was interesting, but just the discussion around rent and what is happening. Because, of course, he mentioned Seattle.
Yeah. So this kind of breaks into two parts, government intervention and rent control. So how could the government get involved and fix this problem? The problem is a supply problem where we don't have enough homes because in previous episodes, thank you to our subscribers, we told you we're 2.8 million units behind on housing. The unsexy problem is the supply problem. What we want to do and what politicians have been doing is they've been blaming the boogeyman. They go, it's the investor, it's corporate America, it's blah, blah, blah. The reality is there are just not enough homes. So where I really agree with and what they were saying is the government needs to incentivize and possibly even subsidize some form of creating more housing. And I'm not talking the government doing affordable housing. I believe in them lowering permit fees, lowering development timelines, cutting red tape, providing tax subsidies, and lower loans for people to deliver housing units quickly and at or around the median. That's what would help our nation. Not go try to build a bunch of affordable housing units, the government, and not try to over-control it. Rent control, he really opposes that. I very much oppose that because what that then does again is it discourages capital investment. And capital markets, what they like to do is capital likes to flow to where there's opportunity. And they flow to opportunity and they flow to problem solving. And when those two things combine, they make a good return on investment, but they also help society. And so if you all of a sudden start capping rents and they start capping rents all around the Seattle metro, what it does is it makes it so investors sell them, corporate buyers pick them up, hedge funds, insurance companies, things like that, and the ma and pa investor goes away. Well, who raises their rents the slowest? It's actually the small-time investor who raises their rents the fastest. The corporate investor, because they have to make a return.
And if they don't have the ability to raise their rents, both of them, the quality of the rental goes down.
Bingo. Then what they do is they start cutting corners in maintenance, in rehab, in turnover, And then neighborhoods start to go down. And then what happens is if a whole neighborhood starts to go down, a whole area goes down, then it requires massive government intervention, massive burning of tax dollars to revitalize a whole area. That's why if you go and look, you can see things that are called opportunity zones. Those opportunity zones are areas that the government has declared need extra economic impact, and so they're willing to give tax credits. That's what they have to do when they go and monkey with things too much and they stick their fingers into it.
Why aren't they doing that? Creating credits and stuff like that for builders.
It's unpopular. It's not sexy. It doesn't create votes. It's easier to sell, I'd rather build something for the homeless and affordable housing than I'd rather help the big bad wolf known as the builder developer build more houses. Well, what if you found a few that were willing to do it and you said, I'm going to cap your profit and just bang these units out as quick as possible? I guarantee there's people that would do that, because there's government contracts where, you get hired by the state of Washington and you're going to go build a road. The government knows how much profit you have in there. Why couldn't they do the same thing just to create enough housing units real quick? If there's more housing units, it'd be more affordable. You get a stable middle class. You get more affordable. You get a happier population. Like, this is win-win, but it's more sexy and it gets more votes to say, there's the big bad wolf over there, the corporate investor, and I want affordable housing. Affordable housing means rentals. Attainable housing means home ownership. We want more homes at the median price and below across the U.S.
Okay, well, that was basically it for the Redfin interview, or the Redfin CEO interview. How would you grade Glenn and his responses and the advice he was giving?
Glenn did a phenomenal job. I mean, really, I'd give him an 8 out of 10. And the only reason I don't even give him a 10 out of 10 is I fundamentally disagree with part of their business model. So realize that's probably my personal bias downgrading him. And then David, I give him a 10 out of 10. He was on point, sharp, phenomenal questions, great stuff. And thank you for sending this to me. And thank you for all of you who listen. Please like, subscribe. Put us your comments below if you think, we missed something that they were talking about.